Hello, in this video, I'm going to talk to you about what happens after the marathon so you can understand how to recover better and faster for your next race. Let's get into it. This is a video all about how you recover from running your marathon, but why should you listen to me? Well, here's a little bit of information about me, Arj Tiruchalvam. I'm the head coach here at Performance Physique, and I have 17 years worth of coaching experience, working with novices and juniors all the way through to Olympians. In addition to that, I've also written a couple of university degrees. That's in sports science, nothing else random. And I've got a wealth of experience working in nutrition as well as coaching. Now, many of us have considered running a marathon. Many of us will have done a marathon, but how many of us have truly thought about what that marathon does to our bodies? And you can see on this slide here, the number of people who are actually running marathons every single year is growing year on year. It's a phenomenal amount of people. That bit of information from the BBC there, and phenomenal amount of people who are going out to run the marathon. And many of those, probably the majority of those, won't have followed a particular training plan to get there. But many of us will consider having a training program in place to make sure that we make the most of this opportunity. Particularly with the London Marathon, it's a very difficult event to get into. I think it's something like only 1 in 6 people actually who enter the ballot get to have their space. And therefore they want to make the most of it, so they get a coach on board, they follow a training program, but no one ever thinks what happens after the marathon. I recently wrote an article on that, and I'll be sharing that in the comments below. Now, there is finally some research to support something I've been talking about for years, and that's the importance of having a backup plan. A plan that you can put in place as soon as you finish your marathon. I'll talk about what I've always encouraged. This piece of research done by Bernat Adel and co, who are looking at the physiological biomarkers of damage following running a marathon. And the actual number of biomarkers and the inflammation that occurred following that marathon is pretty sublime. They looked at lactate dehydrogenase, creatine kinase, high sensitivity troponin T. This is why I have to read it. And C-reactive protein. These are enzymes effectively that appear in blood samples, and I'll talk to you about those very shortly. But they investigated 86 runners. They took these biomarkers before the race, and they took them for several hours and days after the race. They were looking at what point those blood markers returned to normal levels. And that's the important thing here. Most studies have never looked at what returns to normal. So we just know that basically a human body has worked particularly hard. But this article, which was published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning, looks at what happened before, then afterwards, and then once they returned to normal. Little spoiler here, it took a while. What they identified was that every single biomarker increased, but it gets a little bit more interesting. But before we can understand that fully, look at this, or lactate dehydrogenase and creatine kinase. These are two enzymes. These are markers that usually are basically increased as a result of performing difficult exercise, something which is intense or longer in duration. Both of these relate to the degree of metabolic adaptation to training and are involved in muscle metabolism. Now, what we find is it's very normal for people who are untrained to have a slightly higher level of these in their body than those who are well trained. What was particularly interesting though, is that women actually have a slower increase in response to training than men. And this might actually link to something else later on. The other two markers they looked at, high sensitivity troponin T, got that right this time, is a marker of cellular damage. Basically, I've said here, acute myocardial infarction, but basically it's to do with the heart. And that's something which is only ever seen in heart injuries and exercise. It doesn't occur at any other point. And then C-reactive protein, this is produced in the liver and the skeletal muscle tissue actually, which surrounds the heart, and is also in response to an injury. or infection, and is usually a marker of inflammation. So these are quite substantial and scary words that are appearing here as the markers that they were looking into. So if we look at this piece of research, they found that all of these biomarkers continue to rise after the race. We've always talked about, during the race is the really hard part, and then maybe we'll have some DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, but then that's it. No, I've always spoken about the subcellular level damage that occurs as a result of doing the marathon. We know we'll have some muscle soreness, but people tend to think, my legs are feeling fine now 7 days later, let's go again. My own strategy is actually, we need to take a really long, slow recovery program. It's a separate phase of the program to make sure that you're not going to do further damage. Injury doesn't necessarily happen in the acute. It doesn't happen in an immediate response. It happens as a result of this long, maybe extended or more intense training without sufficient recovery. That's when injury happens. They found that some of these biomarkers, the majority of them, remained elevated for 196 hours. That's madness. So this is way past the appearance of muscle soreness now. The recommendation immediately was that no muscle damaging exercise should be performed for 96 hours. And actually, if you read the full paper, you'll see that it goes on past 8 days. The CRP, which was the last one, this is the inflammation marker, was still presenting high levels after 8 days. And that's why we shouldn't really be punishing, we shouldn't be pushing the body at this point still. But think back to when we said that women took longer to get to these increased rates. Look at this point here. They found that women tolerated post-race events, these events of inflammation, these events of elevated biomarkers, much better than men. That has to be linked, right? It can't just be a coincidence. But on top of this, those people who ran faster had greater levels of these biomarkers. So just because you're fitter and you're a faster runner doesn't mean you escape these. It just means you have the capacity to push harder and therefore deliver more of these biomarkers into your body. Whereas those people who were slower had higher rates of the inflammatory responses and still needed to recover, but perhaps wouldn't suffer so badly from the muscle damaging effects. But both groups basically needed to recover substantially. So post-marathon recommendations. If you look just at the practical application of this paper, it basically says that you need to make sure that your recovery process is in place for after 8 days. The first 8 days should really just be focused on reducing inflammation, improving blood circulation, and nothing more. Particularly those who are running faster times. This paper looked, I think the fastest person in this paper was about a 250 marathoner. I think the average time they looked at was 330. Those people need to be looking after muscle damaging activities. So no interval training, no strength training, no sprints, none of those things. It should be nice and easy. This, for me, is an important phase than the lead up to the marathon, or almost at least, because obviously you get a medal for doing the marathon. No one's giving you a medal for recovering well, are they? But we get led astray by seeing so many people compete and do marathons again and again and again. I had someone who did 3 marathons in 4 weeks. It was against my advice, but they did it still. Strength and conditioning. This needs to be your priority. You need to make sure you're really strong and resilient leading up to the marathon. Following that period of time, you can evaluate where were your weaknesses, and then that's when you need to get yourself strong and mobile to make sure it doesn't happen again. But obviously, give yourself that recovery time. And when I talk about recovery work, we're going to do lots of easy running, lots of easy cycling, lots of swimming. And it's going to last for 4 weeks. And during the end of that 4 weeks, that's when we start to introduce quality work, the faster stuff. But for the first 2 weeks, well, for the first week, it's walking only, maybe a little bit of cycling and swimming. The second week, that's when we introduce the recovery work where you can run as well. Now, if you found this video interesting, please hit subscribe. Make sure you like this video. If you have a question, ask it, or stop wasting your time. Get training with me, and I'll help you achieve your goals. My name is Aj. I hope you found this video interesting. More to come soon.